trail camera was still running when I found it. The footage was still on the SD card. And whatever had walked up to that camera in the dark and stared directly into the lens had already picked up my scent, because within 24 hours of me pulling that card and watching that video, it came looking for me. What you are about to hear is the story of how I inherited a cabin, discovered something that should not exist, and barely made it out of those woods with my life. So before we get into it, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. This community has grown into something genuinely incredible, and I appreciate every single one of you being here. Now let me tell you exactly what happened. My father was not what you would call a social man. I say that with no bitterness, just honesty, because it matters for understanding everything that came after. After he and my mother split when I was 9, he basically disappeared into himself. He bought a piece of land in a remote part of the upper Midwest, built a modest cabin on it, and that was more or less where he lived out the rest of his days. No neighbors for miles, no real road in, just a dirt track that turned to mud half the year. Growing up, I would hear from him maybe twice a year, a birthday card that arrived late, a phone call that felt like he was reading from a script. I used to think he just did not want to be my dad anymore, and maybe that was part of it. But the more I think about it now, the more I wonder if he chose that isolation for reasons that had nothing to do with us, nothing to do with his failed marriage, and everything to do with what was out there in those trees. He passed in the early fall. Heart attack, alone, the way he seemed to want to live. It took a few weeks before anyone even found him, which tells you everything about how far out he was. I got the call from a county sheriff who had driven 40 minutes just to reach cell service to notify next of kin. The estate was simple, just the land, the cabin, and whatever was inside it. There was no one else to handle it, so it fell to me. I want to be clear that I did not go up there full of grief or longing for some connection I never got to have. I went up there because it was practical, because I needed to figure out what to do with the property, and because something in the back of my mind was curious about who this man actually was when nobody was watching him. That curiosity nearly cost me everything. The drive up took the better part of a day, and the last stretch of it on that dirt track was rough enough that I regretted not renting something with 4-wheel drive. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by dense, mixed forest, the kind that is so thick you cannot see more than 30 feet into it at any point. It was a decent-sized place, solid construction, clearly built by someone who knew what they were doing and intended to stay. There was a generator, a wood stove, a well, a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the main building. My father had set himself up for self-sufficiency. The first thing I noticed when I got inside was that he had been organized, not in a warm, lived-in way, but in a precise, methodical way. Everything had a place. Shelves were labeled. Supplies were inventoried and dated. It felt less like a home, and more like someone had been running a long-term operation out here, and wanted to keep very careful track of their resources. The second thing I noticed was that my phone showed no bars. 0. Not one. I walked to every window, stepped outside, walked to the tree line and back, climbed up on the roof of the woodshed thinking I might get a signal up high. Nothing. Complete dead zone. My father had lived out here for years with no phone signal, and it suddenly struck me just how alone he must have been, and how alone I now was. I had told people where I was going, so that was something. I figured I would be there 3 or 4 days at most, go through his belongings, take photos of the property for a real estate consultation, maybe get a sense of the man through what he left behind. Then I would head back to civilization. That was the plan. It was a reasonable plan. It did not survive contact with what came next. I found the first one on the second day mounted to a pine tree about 200 feet from the cabin, pointed down toward a game trail that cut through the brush. It was a decent unit, the kind serious hunters use, with a motion sensor and night vision. My father had bracketed it tight to the tree and run the strap through a metal loop that was bolted directly into the wood. He did not want it moving, and he did not want it stolen. I found 4 more over the next couple of hours. He had them placed in a rough perimeter around the property, covering the main approaches through the trees and the open ground near the clearing. This was not someone who set up a trail camera because he wanted to see what deer were passing through. This was surveillance. This was someone watching the tree line deliberately and consistently, night after night, for what I can only assume was a very long time. Each camera had a little weatherproof box zip-tied next to it containing a spare SD card and a small notepad sealed in a plastic bag. I opened one of the notepads and found handwritten logs, dates, times, weather conditions, and brief notes in my father's careful handwriting. Most of it was mundane: wind from the northwest, deer, doe, 2 fawns, coyote passing through around 0200, but scattered through the entries every few weeks or so were notes that made my skin prickle. Large bipedal, blurry reviewing footage, branches broken above deer height, strong smell on west approach reported during last walk. Investigate. He had been watching for something, and based on those notes he had been finding evidence of it for years. I sat down with those notepads and read through them more carefully. The earliest dated entries were from about 7 years before his death, which would put them within a year or two of when he first moved to the property. Even in those early entries, his language was measured and precise. No alarm, just documentation. First sighting at approximately 200 yards. Bipedal, moving fast, did not appear to notice me standing at the tree line. Estimated height 7 feet minimum. Did not match any known species. Set up additional camera west approach. That was it. One paragraph, matter of fact. And then the next entry was about a storm that had come through and damaged one of his outbuildings. What struck me reading through those notebooks was how the tone never changed. He never got more alarmed, never got more agitated, never wrote anything that sounded like a man on the edge of panic or breaking down. Over 7 years, hundreds of entries, he documented these encounters and near encounters with the same calm precision he used to document the weather and the condition of his generator and the state of his food stores. He had simply incorporated this reality into the rhythm of his life and found a way to live alongside it that he considered, apparently, no more remarkable than any other aspect of living alone in a remote forest. That kind of calm either means a person has made peace with something or has given up on the idea of being rescued from it. Looking at those notebooks, I honestly could not tell which one it was. I want to stop here for a moment and give some context, because when I eventually got back to civilization and started researching, I found out that the area where my father's cabin sat has a long and troubled history with creature sightings. The indigenous peoples of that region have spoken for generations about a being they describe as neither human nor wolf, but carrying the nature of both, a figure that walks upright on 2 legs, but moves through the forest with the silence and speed of something built for the dark. These accounts go back centuries. They are not campfire stories told to frighten children. They are cautionary warnings passed down through elders, warnings that treat this creature not as myth, but as a real and present danger to be respected and avoided. In the early logging era, workers in remote camps across the Great Lakes region reported encounters with something large and bipedal that would come into the edges of their camps at night. Several accounts describe the thing standing at the boundary of firelight, watching, not attacking, just watching, in a way that the men found more unsettling than any outright charge would have been. Some of those camps were abandoned mid-contract, the workers refusing to return regardless of the pay they forfeited. There are newspaper accounts from the 1800s in Michigan and Wisconsin that reference strange tracks found near settlements, tracks described as enormous and not matching any animal the settlers knew. Local sheriffs wrote reports about livestock found dead in ways that veterinarians could not explain, not torn apart by predators in any recognizable pattern, but collapsed, as if frightened to death, with no wounds. These accounts were filed and forgotten because there was no framework to put them in, no category in the official record for something that walked on 2 legs like a man, but clearly was not one. One of the most frequently cited early accounts comes from a trapper in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in 1887, who filed a written statement with a local fur trading company explaining why he was abandoning a territory he had worked for 11 years and relocating to a different region entirely. He described being followed for 3 consecutive nights by something he could hear but not see, something that matched his pace exactly and stopped when he stopped. On the third night it stepped out of the trees into the moonlight in front of him, stood upright to a height he estimated at nearly 8 feet, and looked at him long enough for him to observe the face in detail before it turned and walked back into the forest. He left the territory the following morning and never returned. His statement was not taken as evidence of anything, just noted as an eccentric reason for a territory change. But he described that face, and what he described matches what I saw on that SD card over 130 years later. The modern Dogman legend, as most people know, it crystallized through a radio broadcast in Michigan in 1987, a song called The Legend by a DJ named Steve Cook, who wrote it as an April Fool's joke. But what he did not expect was the flood of responses from listeners who were not calling to laugh along. They were calling because the song described something they had personally seen. The calls came from rural areas across Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, farmers, hunters, law enforcement, people with no reason to fabricate a story and a great deal to lose by telling it. The creature in the song matched what they had encountered. That was not a punchline, that was a pattern. The Dogman, as it has come to be known, is described with unusual consistency across thousands of independent reports spanning well over a century. 7 to 8 feet tall, powerfully built, covered in dark hair or fur, often described as dark brown or black, a face that is distinctly canine, with a pronounced muzzle, large ears set high on the head, and eyes that reflect light in a way that does not match any known animal. The creature walks bipedally, often observed running on all fours, before rising to its hind legs when it stops to look at something. It is almost universally described as fast, faster than it should be able to move at that size. And it is almost universally described as intelligent, not animal smart, something else. My father, I realized, had known exactly what he was looking for. He had been living alongside it for years. I collected all 5 SD cards on the afternoon of my second day at the cabin. I brought them inside, poured myself a coffee, and set up my laptop on the kitchen table. I figured I would go through the footage quickly, get a sense of what wildlife was in the area, maybe find some evidence of what my father had been tracking. I was treating it like a curious puzzle, like a window into this man's private obsessions. The first 3 cards were mostly what you would expect. Deer, several of them. A red fox that walked directly in front of camera 2 around 3 in the morning and sat down like it owned the place. A black bear that lumbered past on 2 separate occasions. My father had caught some genuinely beautiful wildlife footage out here, and for a moment I felt something close to sadness thinking about him watching this footage alone, finding small pleasures in it, and never sharing any of it with anyone. The 4th card was from the camera he had positioned on the western approach, the one his notes had flagged most often for unusual activity. Most of the footage was ordinary. And then I hit a file dated about 6 weeks before his death, time-stamped at 2:47 in the morning. The camera triggered on motion and caught whatever came down that trail. For the first 3 seconds of the clip, nothing unusual. Trees, brush, the edge of the trail in that green-gray infrared light, and then it stepped into frame. I actually laughed at first, a short, startled sound, because my brain tried to tell me it was a person in a costume. It was walking upright, 2 legs, moving with a kind of loping gait that covered ground very fast. But then it stopped. It stopped and it turned and it looked directly at the camera, and the laugh died in my throat. The face that filled the frame when it turned toward that camera lens is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I have watched a lot of wildlife footage, and I have seen a lot of things that seem strange for a moment before resolving into something ordinary. This did not resolve. The more I watched, the less ordinary it became. It had a broad, flat forehead above a clearly elongated muzzle. The ears sat high and forward, large and mobile, the way a dog's ears move when it is locked onto a sound. The fur or hair that covered the face and neck was dense and dark, matted in some areas, giving the whole face a texture that looked heavy and ancient. It was not a costume. The way the musculature moved under that fur when it turned its head was not something a costume does. But the eyes were what got me. They caught the infrared light of the camera and threw it back. And in that brief reflection you could see them clearly. Pale and forward-facing, set wide in that broad skull. and they were looking directly into that lens with something behind them that I can only describe as recognition. Not the blank stare of a deer or a bear that has wandered into a camera's range. Something that understood what a camera was and was choosing to look back at it. The clip ran about 10 seconds total. At the very end, the creature leaned slightly forward, nostrils clearly flaring as it scented something, and then it moved off frame to the right in a way that felt less like retreat and more like decision, like it had seen enough, like it had gotten what it came for. When I sat back from that footage, my hands were shaking and my coffee had gone cold. I did not notice either until several minutes had passed. Here is what I did not understand at the time, but came to understand painfully later. The cameras were positioned and maintained by my father for years. His scent would have been all over them, worked into the straps and housing and the trees they were mounted to through repeated handling over many seasons. That western camera, the one closest to where the creature had been detected most often, would have smelled deeply and consistently of one person, my father. When I walked those trails and handled every single one of those cameras on the afternoon of my second day, I replaced that scent, or more accurately, I added a new one, a stranger's scent, unfamiliar, and therefore interesting in exactly the way a predator finds unfamiliar things interesting. By the time I sat down inside that cabin to watch the footage, something in the tree line already knew that the person who usually moved through this territory had been replaced by someone new. I did not know any of this yet. I made dinner, spent a couple of hours going through more of my father's belongings, and went to bed around 10. I left the outside light on, which in retrospect I think was more instinct than conscious choice, some part of my brain already responding to what I had seen on that footage by wanting the perimeter illuminated. I fell asleep without much trouble. I woke up at 2:14 in the morning to a sound from the north side of the cabin that I can only describe as something very heavy setting itself down against the outer wall. I lay completely still for a full 2 minutes after that sound, telling myself it was the cabin settling, telling myself it was an animal bumping into the wall, telling myself anything that would let me breathe normally again. And then the smell reached me. It came in around the window frame like it was following the air current, a smell I cannot fully describe to someone who has not encountered it. Thick and musky and deeply wrong in a way that bypassed rational thought and landed somewhere much more primitive. I have smelled bear before. I have smelled a dead deer. This was not that. This was a living animal smell layered over something darker, something that reminded me of a closed room that had been locked for a long time, stale and heavy and somehow aware. My father's notes had mentioned a strong smell on the western approach. He had written it down matter-of-factly like a data point. Lying in that dark cabin trying not to make a sound, I understood it differently. Nothing came through the walls. The sound against the north side went quiet. After maybe 20 minutes, the smell faded, and I heard something move away through the brush, slow and unhurried. I did not sleep again that night. I sat in the kitchen with every light on, and my father's hunting rifle across the table in front of me, and I watched the windows turn from black to gray to the pale gold of early morning. And when the sun was fully up, I went outside and looked at the north wall of the cabin. The mud at the base of the wall showed marks. Not footprints exactly, more like impressions from something that had stood close and shifted its weight. The grass near the woodshed, about 15 feet from the wall, had been pressed down in a rough oval shape. The kind of flattened area that means something large sat or crouched there for a period of time. My father's notebook suddenly felt less like the private record of a reclusive man, and more like a survival manual I had found too late. I made a decision on that second morning that I now see clearly was the wrong one, but felt completely logical at the time. I decided to stay one more night. I told myself this was because I still had my father's belongings to sort through, but the truth is that some part of me needed to see it again. The footage had shaken me, but it had also hooked something deep in my brain, that part of every human being that evolved alongside predators and cannot help but want to understand what it is being hunted by. That curiosity is a survival mechanism, but it can also get you killed. I spent the day reinforcing what I could. I found boards in the woodshed and braced the north wall window from the inside. I checked the door hardware and found it solid, good thick wood, and a proper deadbolt. My father had built for permanence. I went back to camera 5 and pulled the fresh SD card, figuring it might have captured something in the 12 hours since I had handled it. It had. The footage from 4 in the morning showed the creature back on that trail, this time standing fully upright and absolutely still for nearly 30 seconds before moving toward the cabin, toward me. I also noticed something in the new footage that I had not caught in the first clip. At the very edge of the frame, in the shadows at the margin of the infrared light's range, something moved that was not the main figure. It was quick, just a shift in the darkness, a shape that resolved briefly into a silhouette and then dissolved back into the tree line. The main creature had not come alone on that second visit. There had been at least one more out there beyond camera range, staying back, observing while the other one came close. The word coordinated entered my mind and I pushed it away, because if they were coordinating, if they were actually planning this in some way that implied communication and strategy, then the situation I was in was a great deal more serious than I had been allowing myself to acknowledge. I ate dinner that evening, sitting with my back against the interior wall, facing the room, with every window I could see from my position in view. My appetite was mostly gone, but I forced myself to eat because I knew I needed the fuel. The rifle was propped against the wall within arm's reach. Outside, the evening light faded and the woods went from amber to gray to black, in the way they do so fast when you are somewhere with no ambient light pollution. By 8 o'clock it was as dark as I had ever seen it outside those windows, and the stars were extraordinary. The kind of sky you forget exists when you live in a city. I might have appreciated it under different circumstances. That evening I called no one because I had no signal to call anyone with. I ate, I stacked the chairs against the north door. I loaded the rifle with every round I could find in my father's supplies. I sat in the main room with the lights on and waited. At 1:30 in the morning, the smell came back, stronger this time, and then a second smell layered over it that was slightly different. The same bass note but a different register, like two instruments playing the same chord. And then I heard something I had not heard the night before, a sound from the east side now, in addition to the north. There were 2 of them. I want to be precise about what I experienced because I know how this sounds, and I'm not trying to dramatize anything. I'm trying to report it accurately because I think accuracy matters more than anyone wanting to believe or disbelieve me. What I know is that I heard distinct sounds from 2 separate directions simultaneously, both with that same quality of weight and deliberate movement. What I know is that the smell intensified and split into 2 distinct threads that my nose registered separately before they blended together. What I know is that when I checked the footage in the morning, the SD cards showed 2 separate figures on 2 separate cameras, moving in loose coordination around the property perimeter. The cabin held. I did not sleep. By dawn, the sounds had stopped and the smells had faded, and I was running on pure adrenaline and cold coffee and a bone-deep understanding that this situation was escalating in a direction I did not want it to continue escalating. The rational decision was to pack my essentials and drive out immediately. I know that now, but the morning looked so ordinary. The birds came back, the light came through the trees exactly the way morning light is supposed to, and I let myself believe that the daylight made things safe. I spent the day going through my father's remaining papers. I found detailed written accounts, much more extensive than the field notes, of what he had observed over years of living on this property. He had counted at least 3 individuals based on variation in track size and the different sounds they produced. He had documented seasonal patterns, the way they moved closer in the fall and seemed to pull back in the deep winter. He had written something in his careful handwriting that stopped me cold when I read it. They have accepted my presence. They know I am not a threat, but they do not forget a new face, and they do not forgive intrusion. He had known. He had lived his entire life out here, aware of what shared this land with him, and had reached some kind of equilibrium through sheer familiarity and consistency. He had been here so long he had become part of the landscape to them. I was an intruder. By the third night, I was running on almost no sleep and the kind of stretched thin alertness that comes from sustained fear. I had loaded everything I was taking with me into my car, parked it facing out toward the dirt track in case I needed to leave fast. I had made a decision that I would sleep, just a few hours, because a person who cannot think straight cannot drive safely, and the last thing I needed was to go off that narrow track in the dark. I woke at midnight to the sound of something on the roof. Not the settling creak of old timber in the cold, not a branch scraping across shingles, but impact, footfall, weight moving across the roof above me with a slow and purposeful stride that paused over the room where I was sleeping and then moved again. I was out of the bed before I was fully conscious, rifle in hand, back against the far wall and eyes on the ceiling. The footsteps crossed from one side to the other and stopped. Then there was a second sound, this one from the front of the cabin, and this time it was different because it was coming from inside, or at least from the porch structure at the front, the enclosed entryway that separated the main door from the outside. Something had gotten into that space. I could hear it moving, could hear the wooden slats of the porch floor shifting under weight. The main door had the deadbolt, but the porch entry was less substantial. An older door with a simple latch that had been enough to keep out weather and not designed for anything else. I made a decision in about 3 seconds. The root cellar. My father had built it into the hillside behind the cabin, and it connected through a hatch in the kitchen floor, a proper thick wooden hatch with iron hardware and a drop bar that locked from the inside. I grabbed the rifle, the extra ammunition, a flashlight, my phone even though it was useless, and I dropped through that hatch and pulled it shut above me and slid the bar across in one motion. And then I sat in the dark 6 feet underground and listened to the night happen above me. I will not pretend that the cellar was a comfortable place to spend a night. It was cold and damp and smelled of earth and the preserved goods my father had lined the shelves with. But it held. Whatever was in that porch entryway and whatever was on the roof and whatever else might have been circling the clearing, none of it got through that hatch. The bar held. The earth held. For about 2 hours I could hear sounds above me. Movement across the floor. Something that I can only describe as methodical investigation. The way an intelligent creature searches a space when it is looking for something specific. The sounds moved from room to room in a pattern I could track through the cellar ceiling. Kitchen, living area, bedroom, back to kitchen. At several points I heard sounds that suggested things being disturbed or moved, not destroyed, not torn apart, but handled in a way that implied something trying to understand a space that had smelled like one person for years and now smelled like someone else. My scent was fresh. My father's was fading. I think on some level I had disrupted something that had been stable for a very long time, and they were trying to process that change. There was one moment, maybe around 3 a.m, when whatever was above me settled directly over the hatch. I could see the wood flex slightly under the weight, could hear the creak of it. The drop bar was iron, and the hatch was thick pine, and I told myself it would hold, and it did hold, and after a long moment the weight shifted and moved away. I remember pressing my hand flat against the cold earth wall of that cellar and thinking about the fact that my father had built this space with his own hands, had dug it out and reinforced it, and built that hatch with that specific iron hardware, and how I didn't know in that moment whether he had built it for food storage or whether he had built it knowing there might come a night when he needed somewhere to be that was below ground level and behind iron. Maybe both. The practical and the precautionary coexisted in my father's approach to everything, as I had been learning all week from his notebooks and his organized shelves and his perimeter cameras. He had thought through contingencies. This cellar might have been his most important contingency of all. And if that was true, then he had effectively built me a life raft without knowing I would ever need it. Eventually the sounds stopped. Eventually the night went quiet. Eventually the thin gray light of dawn started seeping under the cellar door that opened to the outside of the hillside, and I heard the birds come back, which I had come to understand meant the area was clear. I came up through the outside cellar entrance at first light, moving slowly and checking the clearing in every direction before I committed to standing upright in the open. The cabin looked intact from the outside. The front porch entry door had been forced open but had not been destroyed. The latch was simply bent. Inside, several things had been moved from where I left them. Not ransacked, not wrecked, just examined. A jar of food left open on the counter. My father's papers shifted across the table. The chair I had stacked against the north door had been moved aside. The north window brace I had put up was on the floor. The roof showed marks in the thin layer of morning frost that had settled overnight. Large marks, spread wide, the kind of spread you would expect from something with a very long stride. They crossed from east to west and stopped near the center, directly above the bedroom. I stood there in the cold morning air and looked at those marks for a long time. I want to say something about that morning, because it is important and I do not think I have fully articulated it. There is a specific quality to the aftermath of a night like that. The world looks completely normal. The birds are back. The light is doing what light does. The mud and the frost and the bent grass are just things on the ground. None of it feels like evidence of anything until you stack the night's sounds on top of it, and the picture assembles itself into something you cannot look away from. My brain kept trying to offer alternative explanations. Bear, deer, wind. The suggestions felt less convincing each time they came up. I had heard what I had heard. I had smelled what I had smelled. The frost marks did not look like any bear I had ever tracked, and I grew up hunting, and I knew the difference. I walked back inside and I stood in the middle of my father's kitchen, and I understood something about this man that I had never understood before, something I had not had the context to understand while he was alive. He had not chosen this isolation because he wanted to be away from people. He had chosen it because he had found something out here that he could not explain to anyone, something he had learned to live alongside, something that had become in its own strange way the most honest relationship of his adult life. He had not been hiding from the world. He had been keeping a vigil over something the rest of the world refused to believe existed. I packed the one box of his personal effects I had set aside, the photographs, the important documents, the small things that would mean nothing to anyone else and everything to anyone who remembered him. I left the furniture. I left the food. I left the hunting gear and the generator and the wood stove and the carefully labeled shelves. I left his carefully organized supplies and his field notebooks and his years of methodical documentation. I left all of it, because none of it was worth what I was going to have to risk to carry it out, and some of it, I honestly thought, belonged to this place more than it had ever belonged to any family. I drove out on that dirt track at around 7 in the morning with the box in my passenger seat, and the rifle unloaded in the back and my eyes in the rearview mirror, more than on the road ahead. Nothing came out of the trees. I did not hear anything. The forest on both sides of that track was dense and still and utterly ordinary looking in the flat gray light of early morning, and if you had driven that same road without the context I was carrying, you would have seen nothing more threatening than a pretty piece of north woods at the beginning of a cloudy day. Context is everything. Context is what separates an unremarkable drive through the forest from the experience of feeling like you're holding your breath for 20 minutes until the tree line finally gives way to the county road. By the time I hit the county road and my phone picked up 1 bar and then 2, I had started breathing normally again for the first time in 3 days. I pulled over and sat for a while before I tried to drive any further, just sat there with the engine running and the heater on and the satellite radio giving me something completely ordinary to listen to. The first call I made was to tell someone I was out and safe. The second call I made was to a real estate attorney to ask about the quickest legal process for transferring remote rural property, because I was not going back up that track. Whatever the land was worth, it was not worth what I had paid for the knowledge of what lived on it. I would make it someone else's decision what to do with that property. I would make sure any disclosure I was legally required to give was as thorough and accurate as I could make it, which was going to be an interesting conversation with a real estate agent. I drove south for about 4 hours before I stopped for food, and I ate a full meal at a diner table by the window and watched the parking lot and the tree line at the back of the property behind the diner, until my waitress asked me twice if I was okay, and I lied and said I was fine. I went back to the folklore after I got home. Not as a curious hobby the way I might have approached it before, but with the focus of someone trying to understand something they had directly experienced. The more I read, the more the accounts aligned with what I had seen and heard and smelled in those 3 nights on my father's property. Witnesses across decades and across a huge geographic spread described the same behavioral patterns. The circling of a location over multiple nights before any direct approach, the apparent coordination between multiple individuals, the response to new scents in a known territory. The way the creatures seem to investigate rather than immediately attack, when they have the advantage of surprise and numbers, as if they are assessing rather than acting on pure predation. Researchers who study these accounts seriously, and there are more of them than most people would expect, point to this as one of the most consistent and unexplained features of dogman behavior. It is too strategic and too consistent across too many independent reports to dismiss as coincidence. There is a theory, and I cannot say whether it is right, that the dogman exists in a kind of ecological niche that it has occupied for a very long time alongside human beings, one in which it is neither fully predator nor fully neutral, but something more complex and context-dependent. The indigenous traditions that speak of this creature do not universally cast it as evil. Some describe it as a guardian or a liminal figure, something that occupies the space between the human world and the wild world, and enforces a boundary between them. Cross that boundary uninvited or enter its claimed territory without proper understanding, and you experience one kind of encounter. Acknowledge its presence and its claim and live alongside it quietly, the way my father appears to have done, and you experience something entirely different. My father never explained any of this to me because he could not. There was no way to have that conversation without sounding like a person who had lost their grip on reality, so he stayed out there alone, watching the cameras, keeping the notes, maintaining the equilibrium he had worked out with whatever shared his land. And when he died, that equilibrium died with him, and I walked into the aftermath without a single piece of context I needed to understand what I was walking into. I made a decision the week after I got home that I had been putting off for a while. I had been in the same city, the same apartment, the same general orbit of my life for long enough that inertia had started to feel like contentment. I was not content. I was just not moving. What happened at that cabin removed whatever was holding me in place. Because when you spend a night in a cellar listening to something with no business being intelligent move through the cabin above you, rearranging your understanding of what the world actually contains, the apartment you have lived in for 6 years starts to feel like a very small and arbitrary attachment. I gave notice on my lease. I arranged remote work for the period I needed. I put my things in storage and spent a few months going slowly, stopping in places that felt right, building a new geography of my life in a different part of the country, somewhere without dense north woods pressing right up to the edges of everything. I am not a person who frightens easily, or at least I was not before any of this. Now I am simply a person who understands the world more accurately than I did before. I think about my father a lot more than I used to. I think about what it cost him to live that way, to hold that knowledge alone, to never be able to sit across from another person and say simply, "You would not believe what is out there, but it is out there, and I have learned to exist alongside it." I think he was probably braver than I gave him credit for. I think the isolation was not weakness. I think it was the only shape his life could take once he knew what he knew. The SD card from camera 5, the one with the close-up footage of the dogman looking directly into the lens, is the only piece of evidence I took with me. I've watched it probably 100 times since coming home. Every time I watch it, I find something new, some detail in the way the face is structured, or the way the eyes move, or the way the shoulders shift when the creature leans in toward the camera, that reinforces everything I experienced in those 3 nights, and makes the rational part of my brain that would prefer a simpler explanation feel a little more irrelevant. What you can see clearly in the footage is a face that belongs to no dog and no human, but carries elements of both in a combination that should not anatomically exist, and demonstrably does. The muzzle is long and wide, the jaw heavily muscled. The brow ridge above those pale forward-facing eyes is pronounced in the way you see in powerful animals built for endurance rather than speed. The fur or hair is dense enough to obscure the exact shape of the skull, except where the bone structure pushes through clearly, at the forehead, at the cheekbones, at the jaw. The expression, and I use that word carefully because I am aware of how it sounds, is not aggressive. It is appraising. It is the expression of something that has decided to have a look at what has entered its world and is forming a conclusion. That camera ran for another 30 seconds after the creature walked out of frame. The trail behind it was empty and still. Somewhere off in the dark, beyond the infrared range of the lens, it was moving through the forest toward a clearing where a stranger had arrived that afternoon and was about to sit down with a cup of coffee and change the course of his own life by pulling an SD card out of a wildlife camera and watching 10 seconds of footage that he cannot unsee. What I want you to take away. I do not tell this story to convince anyone of anything. I tell it because it happened and because the habit of keeping things like this private seems to me now like the worst possible response to this kind of experience. My father kept it private his entire life and died alone in the woods with no one to understand what he had been living alongside. That silence did not serve him. I do not think it serves anyone. If you spend time in remote forest, especially in the Great Lakes region, especially in areas where the historical record has these kinds of sightings concentrated, be aware of what the folklore has been trying to tell you for centuries. The indigenous peoples of this continent did not invent these accounts to entertain themselves. They invented them, or recorded them, or passed them down because they reflect something real that people in those environments have been encountering for as long as human beings have lived in those forests. The markers are there if you know what to look for. Disturbed ground in patterns that do not match known animals. A smell that is wrong in a way you cannot immediately categorize. Wildlife that has cleared out of an area completely. The feeling of being watched from a tree line that looks empty. And if you ever inherit a remote cabin from a parent who chose isolation and left behind a careful logbook full of cryptic notations and a set of trail cameras positioned in a deliberate perimeter around the property, please, for your own sake, watch the footage before you go walking those trails and handling every piece of equipment on the property. Learn what you are dealing with before you announce yourself to it. The trail camera recorded the DOGMAN. The DOGMAN recorded me right back, and the price I paid for that exchange was 3 nights that I will never fully recover from, and a father I never got the chance to understand while he was still alive to explain himself. Some inheritances are more complicated than property and belongings. Some inheritances are a whole new understanding of what the world actually is. For more stories like this, make sure you are subscribed. This community keeps growing because stories like this one deserve to be told, and I will keep telling them.